Greetings, gamers, and welcome to the 47th live stream from the Misfit Gamer Studios. I am your host, Vortex, and this is D&D Discussions. Excuse me. On today's episode, Kage is going to join me in the studio today, and we're going to be continuing a conversation that we started on Monday when I presented my brand new build for the critical death saves. And I wanted to expand upon that conversation and talk a little bit more about the evolution of death and HP from second edition all the way into fifth edition, and kind of the two different approaches that the editions took, and then how I wanted to go a little bit more into what I had mentioned before about building out more about zones when it comes to HP, and what my plans are for High Point and how to develop that, and what that means for the critical death saves, what that means for these zones, and how HP is going to play a part in the future in terms of combat, and why I believe that these changes are going to not hopefully to complicate things, but allow for more development and more role play opportunities in combat instead of just the ideologic fight to the death. So we're going to talk about that. It might be a short stream today. We don't really have much aside from this topic unless we get anybody in chat. So yeah, if you guys are in chat, let us know if you have any other topics. But it might be a short stream today just because we got some other things going on this weekend. But we're going to jump right into it. And then, yeah, we'll see where we go from there. Let me bring Kage in here. Welcome back. Hello. How you doing?
Hey, what's happening, my friends? Greetings.
Nice to have you here. Everybody, you know Kage. He's usually here on Mondays during the D&D Discussions Homebrew Review Edition, where we go over, submitted homebrew or homebrew that we find online, or anything that we're able to, that we want to basically present and kind of give our critique on, something that we might, ideas that we might do differently, and how much we like the item enough to whether or not we want to, bring it into our own setting. So yeah, other than that, we're just going to kind of get right into it. So on Monday, we started talking about my new approach to death saving throws, which was the critical death save.
Critical death. And it was actually really cool. Like, very similar to your custom class, like getting to see how a lot of this stuff actually develops in the realm is very cool, and I liked a lot of the ideas that we came up with because, again, it's as we talked about, it is very hard to really encompass all the things that it means to like come up against death, right?
Yeah.
And what it actually looks like day to day. Like, should a brawl in a tavern feel like a near-death experience, right? Like, should every scenario where I am entering into combat feel like 1 HP is me almost being dead? Right? Like, I can't tell you how many times, like, I've been interacting with my players and, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm almost dead. And I'm thinking, no, like in my mind, like, this is like a friendly duel or a friendly, like, whatever. Like, you're in school and you're testing your abilities against each other. Like, you're not, like, fighting to the death. You're fighting to, your 1 HP is like, all right, I'm not gonna put any more effort into this type deal, like, all right, I'm done, tap out, type deal. Like, and so it's interesting, and like, how do you actually show that? How do you represent that? And so I like the ideas that were coming, and we were talking a little bit earlier, and I think we have some very, very interesting ways of approaching this.
I hope so. I mean, I've been working on how to essentially improve my approach to HP, because in general, HP has shifted so much in terms of how people want to represent what HP means, right? Whether it's just a direct 1-to-1 on that's your life force, like that's basically it. That's you're either you get that and then you're dead. Other people that, have represented it as like a fatigue level. Some people represent it as physical damage, like direct physical, cuts and bruises and blood loss. So there's a lot of different ways to go about thinking of HP. And and I brought this up earlier, and one of my biggest issues in general is that while I respect the need to simplify things, simplify HP, simplify death, having gone back to recently read, I actually pulled out my second edition Player's Handbook today, just because I did want to read more specifically what exactly was written about HP and death in combat. Surprisingly little, at least in the Player's Handbook. I need to reference the DMG.
Yeah.
But surprisingly little was written about it, in the sense that second edition treats death as, or HP as, basically an accumulation of your life. If you're at 0, you're dead. And that was it. In second edition, 0 hit points meant you're dead. You had to get revived, or you had to have a raised dead on you. There was basically very few options that got you back from that. And now in 5th edition, as we all know, we have the death saves, right? You reach 0 hit points, and then you have 3 chances for your body essentially to stabilize on its own, and it'll balance you out. You'll still be unconscious. And I like, that right there alone is why I like it, because it gives you the option for unconscious. I don't think that the death saves, they don't bring you alive, right? You don't get you don't get brought up,
the only time
right?
you can actually come back is if at any point in time in your death saves you roll a natural 20,
right? And
that will bring you back to 1 hit point,
and that's totally fine. And I agree with that. And I think that's the thing is, I like the idea that they incorporated this. You're still incapacitated. You're just not dead. Again, respecting the need to simplify and what they did with it. Both mechanics are simplified well, but I just don't think that they are good enough at representing what they are supposed to be.
Yeah.
And in that, I don't think that they also really match together perfectly. Like, in and of themselves, they're great, but together they do fall kind of short. But it's not their own fault. And I brought this up earlier off stream, so I'm just going to kind of summarize here some of our previous conversation. But it's not so much the fault of the mechanics themselves. I think it's the approach the players, the human players, the real life people take it with. And I think the 2 biggest issues are how players and DMs approach combat, and the inherent issue that human beings are bad with math. And I'm going to break those down. So what I mean by that is, when you have the DM and player engaged in combat, the first issue that I find with the disconnect with HP, what it really means, and why the death saving throws and HP aren't really good mechanics together, is because when you're engaged in combat, typically you have the DM's perspective, which is, I'm going to keep going until I don't have anything left to go after you with, right? I have 6 enemies.
I'm going to exhaust these enemies on you.
Exactly. I don't have anything to lose. So, not necessarily saying it's intentionally like this, but the approach of the DM is typically, I got nothing to lose. I mean, I am every enemy on the board. I'm going to throw out all of my enemies until they're dead, until I do not have enemies to throw at you.
And then you get your...
Exactly. And from the player's point of view, the issue with HP is typically, regardless of your mindset and your ability to role play that you've taken damage, at the end of the day, we typically look at it as long as I have 1 HP, I'm up and engaged in battle. As if, and I'm not saying that you don't think of it as you've taken damage, but from the player's mentality, what you're doing, like, you're still, making your attack rolls, you're say, in your head, 1 HP still means I'm fully engaged in battle, as if I have 100 HP. Your tactics might change. I'm not saying that you're not aware that you're at 1 HP. I'm not saying that you're not going to back out of combat or do something defensive. But the fact of the matter is that you look at 1 HP as, I'm still in combat, just as if I had 100 HP. And I mean in combat, as in, you are still in the initiative. You're still in combat.
You still expect to roll a D12 for that great axe that you're swinging.
So all of that aspect is still ingrained in, I have 1 HP, which means I'm still here. I'm still in the battle. And it's only until I hit 0 hit points. Now, in 2nd edition, it was you're dead at that point. In 5th edition, it's, well, you have a chance to not be dead, but either way, you're out of the battle, unless someone can come get you. Step in the right direction. But when you add in the fact that players and DMs don't play like that. Like they don't look at it as the fact of you're getting close to passing out, you're getting close to being, incapacitated. You just look at it as, am I still in combat or not?
And
Can I
just
still
look
take
at
actions?
what happens when somebody heals somebody who's down. They pop right back up like nothing happened.
Yeah, they just assume like I'm just right. Yeah, and then they just
swinging
immediately go back to attacking.
Exactly.
Right? And looking at that's one of my biggest issues. Right? Is and then you get the complaints of like little amounts of healing don't do a lot, especially later in game. Right? I totally feel that that a lot of early level healing, or actually most healing, is only good early level. Right? Like 1d4 HP does nothing when you have a max 50.
Yeah.
And your enemies are hitting for d12s. What is a 1d4 going to do, right? So these are the situations that I'm trying to overcome, right? Because HP just doesn't come across as what it's supposed to represent the way DMs and players play it. The second issue, like I mentioned, is we're bad at math. Just inherently human beings are bad at math, right? And the idea I mean by that is, let's say you have a character that, has 100 HP or 60, 80, 100 HP, very high level, very high amount of HP that your player has or your character has, and you're down like sub 20. With the previous mindset that, well, as long as I have 1 HP, I'm still engaged in battle. The problem that we're bad with math is you say, okay, 20 hit points, this guy's averaging, 6 hit points of damage every time he hits, right? Give or take. So I got like 3-4 hits. 3-4 solid hits, maybe 5 if I'm lucky.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not taking into account that twice he's done his max damage, which is 16. So when you're inherently walking into it, as long as you're calculating, as long as I have 1 HP, I'm fine. But you're also bad at math, not really thinking of how close. And again, not so much bad at math as you're not thinking, how many actual hits is it going to take me to down me? But the fact of your character would feel the fact that they are a few solid hits away from just being done, right? There's nothing in game to really reflect that knowledge the character has. That feeling of weakness, that feeling of almost not being able to hold the shield, that feeling of swinging the sword a little slower, that feeling of, your mind's almost about to give out, right? You're physically fine. The feeling of blood loss, if anyone's ever felt that in real life. Like, there's all these things happening to your character, but there's nothing to represent it until you reach 0 HP. And when you have players and DMs basically fighting to the death with that mindset of, it's combat, everything goes to 0 HP. Like, when you have that coupled with the fact that people don't really pay attention to the math, especially in reference or in relationship to how the character should feel it, this is where I feel like both of these fall short, because they both solve a very unique and intricate problem, and they're both very well simplified. But I think the problem is they're oversimplified, and I think people are too afraid to fix it because a lot of fixes seem overly complicated. But I think it's because most people try to solve one problem at a time instead of trying to look at it holistically, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they've simplified it holistically, but almost overdone so. And that's really where with High Point, I want to approach it differently, right? I've played around with how to do death for a long time. Excuse me.
Just as a quick point of interjection, I find it interesting the lightweight psychology of when different DMs, because I've heard a lot of people on TikTok and a lot of people in where they find the need to add more detail in the rules, because again, like we've always talked about, we are trying to go beyond the book. The book is a great foundation, and death saving throws, I think, is a good foundation, but for people to build off of, and that's exactly what we're doing here. Is we're adding the genuine complexity of what reality would bring to the table into the game. Now, we could do that when it comes to encumbrance. We could do that when it comes to travel time. We could do that when it comes to how you calculate the passing of the stars in the sky. Yeah. You could do that in a lot of different areas in the game that there's already a foundation for, but The question is, where do you find the most value in it? And I think a lot of the times when you're thinking about combat, like a large part of combat, which is again a large part of the game, a large part of combat is the fear of death, right?
Exactly.
And it's the
consequences.
The consequences and how you approach that and how you honestly, as a player, how am I going to walk into this situation? Am I going to walk into this throne room with the king and am I going to like insult him to his face just because I know that, yeah, they can down me, but the bard can use healing word real quick and then we'll teleport out of there and we'll be fine.
Or hey, we
You know
have a
what I mean?
favor with the local cleric, or the local church, so we got to revive.
We got a
free.
free revive, like
the whole,
no big deal. Yeah.
Like the whole point is the worst case scenario is permanent character loss, and the alternative is temporary character loss. What's the incentive to really be afraid of death, especially if you're in a gaming group that games a lot, has a lot of character swap outs, right? Like, if you really want to get attached to your character, just having the fear of character loss, like in real life, we don't have just the fear of death. You know what I mean? Like some people don't go skydiving because they don't want to, they fear death, which is fine. But there's also people that don't go mountain, that don't, go mountain biking or street biking or don't ride, rollerblades anymore. Do you ride rollerblades because you think you're going to die every time you're on them? No. But a lot of people don't want to go through the other temporary and potential permanent consequences that come with a nasty fall, right?
A lot of people don't want to learn to get good at skateboarding because it's going to require a lot of broken bones to do so, you know?
And the thing about D&D is you can do things cosmetically. You can give yourself scars and all of that. But the problem with HP and death saving throws is in the moment, they don't incorporate the actual status of the character. 4th edition tried to do this with being bloodied. 4th edition made an attempt. Like with everything else, they failed miserably. But
I mean,
they at least addressed a problem. They looked at it as there should be some sort of status effect based on your fatigue level and your ability to engage in combat. So I respect him for at least engaging that because I haven't really seen that in other editions. But yes, with death saving throws and HP, in the moment, they don't really reflect what's going on with the character and their current status. And after the fact, if you have a way out of it, there's no actual repercussions other than potentially losing your character permanently or just temporarily until the party gets them back. But that's, to me, again, it's not about making the game super, super realistic, right? It's D&D. There's magic, right? It's not about realism, but it's kind of like what we talk about the in-game physics, right? There's got to be a point to where why is it fun that I can be brought to every gaming session. I can be basically brought to near death or die. And the very next gaming session, I'm walking down the street like I was gaming session 1, right? Like my character literally, other than if I chose to put a scar on his face or something, and maybe he acts different, there's literally nothing telling the original version of my character apart and this version other than I have better equipment, right? Like that's the thing I feel like is missing is the game's interaction. Like it's one thing to have a character build. It's one thing that we love to do, which is play the character and change the character build as the character evolves. But getting the game to give opportunities to change the character. We've talked about this where it's like, you don't want to force players into something that they may not want.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes you need to allow the game to do exactly what they're doing. They are making permanent changes to the setting, to the world, to the story. I don't think it's it's unnecessarily evil to allow once in a while a change in the other direction. But it depends upon how you approach it, right? You don't want it to kind of force it on the character. You don't want to make the player not have a choice. And you talked about this a lot too. It's the player agency. You don't really ever want to put them in a situation that could derail their whole build without giving them a choice. Like, hey, if you do this and you mess up, you could lose the ability to cast magic. You now know the risk.
Yes.
If you choose to go, you don't get to get mad. Whereas if you're like, oh yeah, you want to do that? Cool. You just lost all your ability to do magic. Oh, well, you shouldn't have done that. Oh, you didn't read like you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
that's, like I totally get what you're saying. And that's why the approach should be good. So, and I think that was one of the major things that we talked about with my critical death saves is how do you approach the viability like beforehand with, hey, this can happen. So with this new approach, I think I fixed that because it kind of develops that pre-warning. With this new system, like the critical death saves, not feeling like you're just going to get stuck with a permanent debuff. This will be kind of a better way to balance out how rare that will happen and to kind of solidify when those rolls should happen. So I've kind of, for those who've been following, I want to go over some of the newest changes I've made to how I do HP, and I'm going to show how I want to, in the future, incorporate the critical death saves I talked about on Monday. But yeah, just to kind of quickly recap though, those, the reasons why I don't really think that HP and critical death saves just aren't working right now is because they don't show what's happening to the character in the moment, and they don't really have any ongoing consequence. Dying and coming back to life means nothing. And when you take that away, it's just,
you're respawning.
Who cares? Exactly. It's like when you take away the ability to die permanently, like what is the risk other than, we'll have to try again. It's kind of like the video game logic. So the way that I think a good potential way to solve this is trying to represent HP the way it is supposed to be represented, right? So we can talk about what HP is supposed to represent, talk about it being, people in, a fight to the death, and that's just their ability to survive. But it doesn't do that, right? It doesn't actually act that way. You can say what it represents, but it still just acts as a number, and all that matters is it's not 0. Realistically speaking, all that matters is it's not 0. Beyond that, it's just how much damage is the enemy able to do and how much do you have left beyond that, whatever that is. But outside of that, HP doesn't do anything. The more you have or the less you have does not do anything to your character, technically. And that's what I want to kind of solve here. So the first stage that I want to do is I'm upgrading what I used to call the death zones. And I'm going to change that name. So what I originally did, kind of just as I don't think I've talked about this much on the stream. Originally what I had was once you reached 0 HP, I had these calculations to give people a unconscious and a death zone, but beyond 0 HP. So once you hit HP, you had a certain number of hit points into the negative that as long as you fell within those, you were just rendered unconscious. And because again, in second edition, it was just straight death. And I'm like, I feel like there should be a chance that you just got too much damage and you took a system shock and you're down. And then beyond that was just flat out, that was way too much. You just can't even survive that. But it gets complicated, and I felt like I'm basically not trying to Band-Aid fix, but I feel like I'm adding complexity to a system that instead, basically I felt like it showed me the system is broken. So instead of adding complexity, I should just fix it at its base, right? Fix what HP is instead of trying to add complexity to make it better.
To do a thing that you're trying to get it to do, yeah.
Exactly. And so one of the things that I've done, and I don't know if I mentioned this on stream either, is so in High Point, one of the first things that I changed when doing character creation is everybody that creates a character in High Point, once you've created the character and then we start doing like the rolls and everything, everybody starts out with a base 10 HP. And then starting at level 1, you get the dice rolls from your character, your hit die.
Yeah.
And that was one thing that I changed for a couple of different reasons. One, it really does get boring to me as a DM to have to accommodate for such low level characters. And it's not that making low level encounters are difficult. It's just the idea that you do have to pay attention to someone's going to have 1 to maybe 3 hit points.
The wizard meme, man. You like somebody breathes on you wrong and you fall down dead.
It's just, it is annoying. It disrupts the player's agency and gameplay. And I don't think that early on, especially because a lot of the times when you're that early on, you could be playing with some new players. I don't really think it aids them in working into the game and working into their character. I think it's too much of a barrier. So adding a base 10 HP still gives every class their boost, but the base 10 HP, in my opinion, is also kind of setting you apart from the average peasant who has 1 HP, right? I don't necessarily agree with, I think 4th edition also did this, which I don't agree with, which was their level 1 adventurer was essentially an already established adventurer, or was that 5th? I forget what edition did that, but one of them was like,
I know very little about 4th edition.
I remember one of the editions had this mindset where once you got to like when you were a first level character, you were already established. You're already an adventurer, have a past, have a history, you have done things. People like you're kind of already something, and then this is just where your main storyline picks off. And I don't agree with that, right? Because that doesn't make any sense that you could have, led armies, but now you're a level 1 and everything you face is now more powerful than you. But you led armies before. You know what I mean?
Right.
I don't necessarily like that. But I do agree that, to be an adventurer is not for everyone. You have to be of a different caliber. You have to be of a different,
Yes.
You have, like, again, being an adventurer means you have to be able to survive multiple nights, out in the wilderness. Most peasants can't live without creature comforts. Like you and I might be able to go outside without a jacket right now and be fine just because of the conditions that you and I like to put ourselves in. Mm-hmm. But there are some people who, even they may be our same age and same, relative everything, they might actually get hurt from that. That could actually do permanent damage to them if they are not adequately familiar, if their body isn't, because we're not doing anything intentionally, but you and I can go outside and go into certain extreme conditions that other people can't. Because, with the training and experiences that we have had, that could hurt, not necessarily kill, but that could hurt people for them to be exposed to that, like we can endure.
I've actually seen people who in certain cold situations, like their skin will crack and bleed because like they can't, like their body doesn't. It might not have like the elasticity or like whatever it is, but
and that's 100% true. Is it? And then you notice like there are people of of certain Caribbean islands who are more predisposed to being in water for longer periods of time. Their skin does is better adapted to being in water for hours upon hours, whereas a lot of other people, especially from like Western Eastern countries, we just won't be able to stay in salt water without like damage to their skin. Or some kind of, long-term issues. So, when you look at that, it's like, that's why I like the idea of adding that base 10, because an adventurer is a caliber different than a peasant.
Yeah.
You were born for this, right? You were naturally different. Regardless of what your story is, the idea is you became an adventurer for one reason or the other, but like, you could be you could just be a street urchin, right? With other street rats, and eventually you just wanted to go to the next town. But why? Why you? Why did you, among all the other people that you were with, why did you go to the next town? It's because you were the one who had the gumption, the one who had the ability. You were the one who had the aptitude to survive. If your backstory says you're the last survivor of a certain gang, that's because you could. It doesn't matter what your backstory is. If you think about it, regardless of what your backstory is, the reason why you got to here is because you possess something that the average person doesn't. And I'm okay. And that's why like the stats make sense. Why everyone else's stats are base 10 and you can have these fluctuating. It's your uniqueness. It's High Point has a very specific reason why players are very different than everybody else. But when it comes down to that, I felt like 10 points isn't that much. It adds a little bit more flexibility early on. Does nothing later on. Like, when you talk about 10 points, when you're at 60 hit points, 10 points is one hit.
Especially because like the I feel like the scale of damage is very different in different editions. Like,
exactly.
I don't think there's like as higher rolling numbers in like 5th edition as there was in like 1st and 2nd edition. Like, I feel like people are rolling for like hundreds of points of damage in like 2nd edition and stuff like that. And
you still can in certain situations in 5th, but
you can, but like you gotta try really hard.
And that's why it's like I like when you're a level 1 or 2 having 10 points of hit points already. It's just nice to be able to be a little bit more flexible with your abilities. Now I don't necessarily give every enemy an extra 10 points, right? That doesn't necessarily happen, but I do adjust. But the idea is to allow them to not feel as weak, them to, the new players to feel out their characters, get into the characters before you get all your abilities and everything. And then we can start worrying once you get to like level 3 to 5. Then we can really start worrying about good, like intensive combat. Then level 10, 15, you start getting into, okay, now you have to actually like try, right? And I like that progression. So right off the bat, that's one of the things that I do is give everyone a base 10. Right off the bat, I feel like it helps get people comfortable with what's going on. But even at level 1, 10 hit points, I mean, again, as a wizard, that's only a 6 hit point difference. That's 2 hits. That's giving a wizard 2 extra hits, 2 extra rounds, or 1 round, right? Like, so is it really giving lower level players much? No. But it's letting them survive more than a 1-hit kill, right? Or a 2-hit down. It's giving them 1 or 2 extra rounds in combat and giving them more of that feeling. But luckily, so this is something I've done always. This is something that's been in a high point for several years now.
Right.
However, kind of like what we've always talked about in terms of like how building the realm always ends up kind of working out on its own. This new idea that I have actually plays perfectly into this, right? Because I was worried that this new idea I had didn't really play well with low hit point levels, like with low level characters. Mm-hmm. But when you tie in the fact that I give a base 10 automatically and then you start rolling immediately, so you get base 10 and then you get your first level hit die, right? Mm-hmm. So you're already going to be 10 plus at least one. So
10 plus something, yeah.
Everyone's going to have at least 11, right? Like no matter what, everyone will always have at least 11 hit points at level 1. Mm-hmm. Level 1, 11 hit points. That's kind of nice. But that leads into what I want to do with active. So we're going to break this down because, like I said, hit points right now fail in 2 different ways. They don't show the current representation of the status, and they don't have any long-term consequences. So started at base 10 is going to help with how this works, because what I want to do is break out the HP essentially into zones, kind of like what I talked about before, but instead of having negative zones, I want to break out your current HP into these zones. And I think that by doing this from the start, not making it super complicated, but doing this from the start will solidify the ideas of why combat and why close, like, oh my God, we almost died combat should be more feared and should be leaned away from. And you know, like I want to basically make more of a culture where I don't want to say fights should be one-sided, but I don't think every fight, because in my personal opinion, with 5th edition, one of the hardest things that I have is the way that it wants you to develop combat and encounters. I feel like almost every single combat in 5th edition is near death. I feel like almost every single combat I've ever had in 5th edition, I was literally within one attack. Even in Baldur's Gate, almost every single encounter in Baldur's Gate, I'm within
Somebody's
one
about to
attack.
die.
Or someone does die. And I'm just like, I can't even tell you how many stories now I hear of other players and other DMs where it's like, oh yeah, 2 of the players died, or oh yeah, at least, it's like I died, or like my cleric went down. And it's like, why is that so common? But there's no consequence for it, right? You either lost the character or you brought them back. But I don't feel like combat should be one-sided all the time. I don't feel like the character should steamroll everything and then just get steamrolled in return. But I don't feel like everything... I feel like there should be a balance between you lose hit points, they lose hit points. But like any fight, there's going to be a slight snowball effect. Someone's going to finally slip up and the tide's going to turn and the combat's going to end. And I want that balance between having a good, man, that fight felt good up until this moment. And that's when we knew the fight was over, right? And that's kind of how real fights can work. And so this is how I want to incorporate this, because starting this way, I feel like it'll make combat more dynamic. I feel like it'll make more opportunities for role play and for long-term character development. And it will give close combat that like fear of, ooh, I didn't want that, right? Like it will give you that like moment of pause when shit's hitting the fan. And it will also solve the long-term effects of coming near death. So I've gotten rid of the unconscious zone, and I've technically gotten rid of the old dead zone. And what I've replaced them with is, first we have weakened. So now we have a new status effect, similar to 4th edition's bloodied. But weakened starts at 25% of your current health. So we're going to keep it very, very simple here. And luckily with high point, because you already start with a base 10, 25%, like I said before, I was worried that at low levels, a 4 hit point wizard, 25% is 1 hit point. Doesn't make much sense. But when you're already at 10, at least with 25, you're already at least at, 2. If you have 11, 12, you're already at 4 hit points. So you have a range almost. By the time you're level 2 or 3, that 25% is a several point range.
Right.
And it will quickly grow as you grow. So that's one of the solutions that I wanted to just tie in because I brought that up of why it is kind of nice full circle that this new system is actually being benefited by an old rule that I made, which is adding that 10 point, base. So I call it the weakened state. And essentially what happens is when, a creature is brought to 25%, within 25% of their max health. So
for example, if somebody's got 100 hit points, if they are below 25
at or
hit
below
points.
25 hit points.
Got it.
The weakened state would apply.
Okay.
Now, I'm still working on this, so we don't have exacts. Now, I'm deciding whether or not to go more combat or encounter related debuffs with the weakened state, or class debuffs, as we've kind of talked about before. And so the difference right here, my initial ideas are we could do generalized ones. When you're in the weakened state, you maybe lose AC, you lose a D4 on your damage, you lose, 2 points, you have a -2 to attack or to hit. Something like that. Something combat related where it would directly affect, and that would be a flat one, right? So again, talking very simply, we could just do a flat, you're going to lose 1 AC, 1 point to hit, whatever. Basically showing that you are now fatigued. You are now in this combat, you have received enough damage that you are now in a state to where you are not as effective. This is the snowball effect. It happens with other creatures too. Once you start to get that, it makes it harder for them to fight, right? So the balancing there is the entire party wouldn't be like this, but that's where you have to be more tactical. So one direction is a blanket, you lose combat effectiveness, right? Whether that's AC to hit or whatever. The other option, which I'm leaning towards, slightly more complicated, but because you can make a rule set, it wouldn't be overtly complicated. But the other option is that the weakened state applies to class, right? So you either have class debuffs. So these are just going to basically be blanket debuffs for that class, or you're going to have debuffs to the combat or the encounter. And those would just be to anybody, right? So like, again, loss to AC, a loss to the ability to hit them. Those are just things that can happen to anybody. But you have things like class debuffs, which I kind of like more. And we talked about this a little bit before stream. Now, these I like more because these are the things that will make every player not just feel like, okay, yeah, I'm not going to hit them as well, guys. I have to back out of combat a little bit, or I can't do X, Y, Z, or hey, guys, I lost AC, so I shouldn't tank right now. That's good and tactical and all, but making it feel personal, right? Like attacking something that you're good at makes it feel, in my opinion, it makes it feel better. So the reason I want to go class, is because you can target things that make that particular character good, right?
Right.
Like a paladin may not worry that he has 1 less AC if he has a bulky AC with his armor. And we even talked about this too, where it wouldn't necessarily make sense if he's wearing something like full plate mail, where all of his AC is in his plate mail.
Yeah.
It really isn't in his ability to dodge. It's in the ability for
there are a lot of people who have dexterity based ACs. Yeah.
Right. So the problem with that is when you say, oh, your AC is down, well, how does that really make sense depending on what your AC is? So if you have a class based one, this one really attacks the heart of what people are good at, right? So I like this idea because once you're in the weakened state, you can start to take away people's effectiveness. Like with wizards, if they're in the weakened state, maybe they have a percentage chance of failing the spell. Or I think what else did we come up? Oh yeah, so like a rogue. You imagine a rogue, right? They're not going to be able to take a lot of certain types of damage. So you would imagine that they might have like a disadvantage at stealth because they're either making too much noise or getting into positions to hide would be too difficult. You could slow certain characters down. They're not going to be as fast or be able to move as far because of being in this weakened state. Disadvantages, like maybe a monk would have disadvantage on like physical attacks or physical anything. So like grapples, they'd have disadvantage on grapple because they're physically hurt, so it's going to be harder to hold. So you could do these class-based debuffs that I think are a fantastic idea because they're blanket ones, but you target things that, again, a paladin and plate mail isn't necessarily going to need an AC debuff because the plate mail is taking all of the brunt of it.
Yeah.
But if you took his ability to swing his sword away, so now he has either does less damage, like you do now, like negative D6. So whatever your damage roll, now roll a D6 and minus that from the damage you deal. Just because you're not doing it. You're not being able to throw that around because you're in this weakened state. You know, and that may be a little bit too much. Maybe it's a D4, right?
Right.
But the idea is that you target whatever the class is good at, or just generally what makes sense, right? So you think about, we haven't talked about Druid yet. So let's take a Druid who's 25% life. They are spellcasting, they're communicative with nature. So, and they're kind of harmony, right? So similar to wizards, where maybe wizards have like disadvantage on concentration spells. You know, you could tell, maybe wizards have a disadvantage on nature-based spells, or maybe their harmony is being messed up.
I think for druids, something that could, I think it might be interesting to limit their wild shapes or change what, like maybe like they can temporarily not wild shape, or they have to roll a check
maybe it takes twice as long. So if it's 1 round, maybe it takes 2 rounds because you physically. So yeah, so things like that where again it feels disastrous, but yeah, it's that snowball effect. It's going to take you a little bit longer, a little harder. You're gonna have to work harder for it, but you're also in that negative. And to do this with enemies, I think with for the DMs, enemies would just get like massive the normal debuffs, right? They hit less.
What about things like, because a lot of the times you think about, okay, I as a player have to be smart about when I approach and when I back off because of how close I am to death. But like you were talking about earlier, a lot of the DMs are just like, I'm just throwing everything at you and I'm going to go until everything's dead, right? But if you have like a group of barbarians or a group of robbers, right? Like somebody who's just ambushing you and they just want your money.
Right.
Like, are they going to fight you to the death for your money? Or are they going to...
That's exactly my point, right? I don't believe that these robbers who just wanted to rob you and then found out who you really were, they're more likely to run away. But if you can, if everyone's just going straight for the death kill, that's where you get the concept of murder hobos, is because you don't have another mindset, right? But like the weakened state, you could start doing things like you can make first, if the enemy gets in the weakened state, maybe they have a percentage chance. So beforehand, the DM could say, hey, these enemies have this much reason to succeed. So I'm going to give them a 30% chance to run away if they're weakened. But these enemies, they really don't have any reason to succeed. They're just, they're robbers. They're just trying to get some cash. So they're weakened, 90% chance they're running. But these guys know they're assassins. 5% chance they're running. You know what I mean? Like, so you could do that, right? As a DM, you could basically say, what's the likelihood? Like, how much is this needed? The more it's needed, the less chance they're going to run away when they become weakened. That could be one of the things. Right. And then if they stay, they have things like every enemy has -2 AC. Every enemy.
I mean, they would have their own drawbacks, just like you as the player would have drawbacks. Yeah.
To make it easy on the DM, you would just do a blanket drawback, but you also have the chance for them to run away. Right. Or disengage or whatever. So I think that makes more engagement and opportunities for DMs who aren't really thinking about that, right? So it's like once you have that trigger of, oh, they're weakened, should they run away? It's just one more option, right? And warning the players, right? Getting into this weakened state really does, like, it's one thing when you're in combat to like have someone low in life, but you're like, most of you are like, okay, we're probably just going to lose him. We're probably just going to lose that character. We'll make up for it. Whereas getting into the weakened state, it's like you haven't quite lost them, but they are now not as effective.
Okay, so question. With this mindset, is there consequences for going in and out of the weakened state? Or so if I heal you out of the weakened state...
So I would say, to not make any more complication with this idea, I would say that in and out of the weakened state... I would say that we can discuss maybe a counter if we play tested enough to where it gets to a point to where it's like, man, you really are just bouncing in between. Maybe you have a play counter, and for every 3 times you enter into the weakened state in the same combat, you gain like a fatigue. You gain like 1 or exhaustion.
Interesting. I like that.
You gain 1 point of exhaustion for every
But
every
I really
2 times
think
or something
that,
like that.
this mentality is gonna teach people to not wait until you're down to start healing people.
Exactly.
Right? Because it's like,
you don't want the debuffs. You want to keep people away and
Yes.
keep people up. And 25% isn't, I mean, again, if you're at 10 hit points, you know, you're at 2, right? That's all the way down at 2. So it's good. You're already going to be very, very close to dying anyway. It makes sense. If you're at 100 hit points, that's all the way down to 25. You're going to be able to take more, but at the same time, you're feeling it, right? It's because it's a ratio. That's why I like the percentage points and not flat numbers. So with the weakened state, it's basically, my vote is to divvy out all the classes and figure out, you know, like maybe it's like fighters, because they're all about attacks. Maybe they lose points into hit, right? Fighters lose points to hit. Maybe mages lose concentration. Paladins lose damage, you know, or, you know, barbarians lose damage, like things like that, right? Like the idea is you target whatever they're best at and they get a debuff in their class when they become weakened. As for the enemies, there's a percentage chance that you decide of running away or disengaging in the combat. And again, that disengagement could be conversation. You know what I mean? Maybe you say they don't run, but maybe they're going to try to conversate their way out. So you give them that, and then otherwise you just give them debuffs, right? You give them negative to hit, negative ACs, and then you just drop them to make, again, it's that snowball effect. They're just going to be easier for the fight. So that's stage 1. And I really like that. I think that right off the bat, that begins, it plays off what 4th edition attempted to do with Bloodied, but it really gives the mindset of, hey, like combat's starting to turn the wrong way. And what I was trying to say before too about the balance of combat is giving 25%, usually, like, again, for later combat, getting down that low has probably been a couple rounds, right? You probably had a good couple rounds of combat really getting into this. So you have that like first 50% of your life to really decide, like really get into the thick of combat, right? You have like 50% of your life to just give it all you got. And then right under 50%, between 50 and that 25, you're going to start to go, okay, once we hit that 25 mark, the battle is taken either the proper turn because it's them who are at 25, or it's the party that's at 25 and you're like, okay, the battle's starting to turn, right? And that is another thing that we're missing, is until someone goes down, there's really no trigger. And unless you're paying attention and someone calls it out, there's no ingrained trigger to say the battle has turned tides.
It's so weird because like when I play, like I create like, I mean, clearly like if there's a map, like I can see the map, but like for the most part, I have like a mental map in my mind. And like when I envision my other party members and like we're in combat, like I'm envisioning them there, right? And like, but like if somebody's down, like I envision them like they're down, like the whole, but if just imagine like, if their little marker in my mind is like this white character, but like when they're bloodied or when they get to their weakened state, they turn red or something like that. There's like an indicator on them, right? There's just something that alerts you, hey, something's going on here. Like if I'm looking at them as a person, or if I'm looking at them on the character board, like I'm going to remember, oh, you're weakened. Oh, you're bloodied. Oh, you're hurt. Right? Like there's other times where it's like, oh, I remember you got hit, but like how much was it for? And how low are you? And like, is that really that bad? You're the barbarian, you took half damage. Like, and like there's so much, like so many aspects you gotta remember. But if somebody calls out, hey, I'm weakened, like that just raises a flag, and like you're there. It's like,
and it feels like it's, you know, especially when you have like a smaller party, it's like that. Just, it feels like, especially it's like if you're a party of 5, you have 2 people weakened, but you've killed the majority of the enemies, and then the big bad goes weakened. You feel like you've just turned the tide of battle, right? But there's really nothing about that. That's one of the things I felt like Bloodied kind of felt like sometimes, is there was a benchmark.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody was always like, is it bloodied yet? Is it bloodied yet? And then when it finally got called out, you were like, okay, we're half. You kind of feel, because now you have a judgment, right?
Yeah.
You've been, okay, it took us 5 rounds to get them bloodied, probably going to take at least 3 to 5 more rounds, right? Of this many attacks. Like, you can judge where you've been. Weakened, I feel like, is one of those things where, there's going to be a tell that the person's off, right? There's just a tell that they might, again, the dice will tell the real story. They may look a little off, but they may still be hitting with full force. That's how the dice work. You're not taking that away. But the fact that there's going to be some sort of sway in the combat, there's going to be some sort of sign that one side is leading the other.
Yeah.
That's what I feel this will do, is it will call to action people to start to heal, start to work tactically together. But it will also just kind of give a better benchmark of where people are at in battle and how the battle's going. Because the more the party that's in this weakened state, it's going to snowball very, very fast.
Right.
And that's the idea, is like, if 2 people are weakened, but one person's debuff is worse than the others based on your equipment and the situation, now you can prioritize who to heal better.
Right.
Because it's like, hey guys, look, the paladin, his AC's down. That sucks it in his weakened state. But he still has more hit points overall. The fighter is losing damage, or, vice versa. But the fighter,
right.
we need him doing all of that right now because he's our only chance.
Yeah.
Heal him. So instead of just saying who has the most attacks left or who has like a spell left, you could be slightly more tactical and go, well, whose debuff is worse right now? Who can survive their debuff? If you're taking damage away from one person and AC away from the other, who's more important? Is the person you took AC from more likely to go down? Or is the person who you took damage from more likely to be able to kill the enemy if they have that damage back?
Right.
And that, to me, is way more tactical and way more of a battle sense than, well, do you have any spells left, Paladin? Well, how many attacks can... You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
It's more of that, well, who's important and what is important, right? Because the Paladin may be just as important. He may be even more important than the fighter. But if he has 100 hit points and he's at 24... and the fighter has 80 and he's at 10, there's a bit of a difference there. But again, who's more important to stay up? There's so much more to think about. And so that's why I like weakened state 25%, especially with the 10% bonus. You don't worry about low levels. And the higher you get, the more it makes sense that this range, you can survive in this range for longer, right? The more experienced you are, the more things that you've gone through, you have a larger weakened zone. You're able to tough through your weakened zone. When you're brand new, when you become weakened, you just go into the fetal position. You're just like, I can't handle that. But you go through that and your weakened state is a lot more tough, right? Your pain tolerance is more tough. And that's the idea of what this weakened state is all about, is how much were you able to ignore everything until this point, until it starts to affect you.
Interesting.
So that's where we have weakened. Now, the next stage of this is it's going to replace what I used to have as the unconscious zone. So the weakened state is just kind of the first zone to start inflicting a more active combat feel, like things are starting to happen. What I then want to do is when you drop down to 10%. So the idea is that when you were dropped into or dropped down to an HP level that is within 10%. So if you have 100, if you take damage that drops you to 10 or below, or you're already 10 or below and take more damage, but not to 0. So basically just any damage that puts you in or continues while you're in 10% of your max. This is like essentially I don't want to call it a critical zone because we've already talked about how critical is being overused. But this is like, it's not really the unconscious zone, but essentially, I haven't found a good name for it yet, but this 10% zone, so you have the 25% weakened, this 10% zone, if you're dropped into it or if you take damage while in it, you have a 50% chance of going unconscious. It's just a flat, you might be able to work with your DM or talk about character or class differences, but the idea is, for my base idea, it's when you're within 10% or get dropped into 10%. So if you're at, if you have 100 hit points max and you're dropped to 20, you're in your weakened zone. Let's say you take 11 more damage. Now you have 9. Roll percentiles. Now, you could also say a constitution check or a DC, a Constitution DC check.
Yeah.
If you wanted to do a DC check, I would suggest doing a Constitution. I like the idea of a 50-50 because it's kind of just flat across the board, and you'll see why here in a minute because it also applies to enemies. And that's why I think it's better because if you're doing Constitution checks, if you do it with enemies, then there's just a lot of numbers the DM has to remember. If you do a 50-50, it is just kind of random. But if you want to give more agency, like we've talked about, do a DC check. And then I would, as a DM, enemies have a 50-50 chance. Players have a DC check of their Constitution. Or in High Point, it would be just a Constitution check directly against their Constitution. But the idea for this is when you're within that 10%, you take damage into the 10% or while you're in it, and you lose, hit points. You're gonna have this chance to go unconscious. Now, the reason why I want this is because it makes sense. If you're close to death and you're taking damage, you're probably just barely holding it together. You know what I mean? Like, you're just like the idea if you have 10 hit points and you get reduced to 1, you're not quite dead.
I will
but
say
being
that
able to stay together is.
I will say that depends on like the scenario because there are some scenarios where you're like adrenaline mode, like Goku Super
and
Saiyan type stuff.
This is where I said work with your DM. Situations, classes, certain feats. Maybe you have a feat where it's like, hey, if I go into my, whatever this we're gonna call this, my wary zone. Oh, we'll call it that. You're wary. You're about to pass out or something. But weary. It would be more weary, not weary,
right.
But weary zone. But whatever we end up calling it, the idea is like, hey, I have this feat where if I go into this zone, I have an advantage on my throws. So I have advantage to not pass out.
Right.
Because I do agree. They should not be blanketed. These are just my initial approach. But that's a good point, is having feats, having class features or something that allows you to overcome this, I agree with. I just think that as a base approach, this 10% area is designed to essentially, you have the weakened state, which represents your fatigue starting to fail. 10% is basically you're barely holding it together, you're on the brink of death, and whether it's just too much blood loss, a blunt blow to the head and you just go unconscious, but there's a reason why. And again, what I mean by this is the reason why I'm not calling it unconscious zone is because it doesn't necessarily mean unconscious. It's more of an incapacitation chance, because the idea is that you may not necessarily be unconscious, but the fight's over. So like let's say you're paladin, right? Your paladin gets into this 10% and he loses his roll. It's not so much that he's unconscious and he lost too much blood, but maybe he's just too weak to stand up in his armor. Maybe he just can't raise his sword. So the idea is whether or not you pass out or are just done for the fight is kind of more on the attack that happened and how much damage you received. But this is essentially to solve two things. One, the active combat and dynamic of what's happening with HP and what your character's going through. And two, to help alleviate the need to call out this final hit is non-lethal, I just want to knock him out. This is more of this is a real thing that can happen whether you want it to or not. Right.
I think that wouldn't make that go away. That would 100% still happen because it's only a chance.
Yes.
And people are specifically trying to do a thing. They're still going to want to say, hey, whether it hits in this zone or not, I would love this to be non-lethal damage.
I honestly think
those call-outs.
I think non-lethal damage, or at least non-lethal kills. Like I think that should always be called out. I think it should be more encouraged to be called out at the beginning of battle. Honestly, like to me, I think players need to be encouraged to say, "Hey, that guy, we aren't killing him." Just allow that call in the beginning of the battle to say, we will kill everybody else if it comes down to it, but that one, non-lethal all the way, right? Mm-hmm. Just call it out so everyone knows he's not going down. But you're absolutely right. I think it should still be called out. I just also like the dynamic of you could inadvertently not kill someone.
No, I don't disagree with that.
And for DMs, this gives you a chance to play off they're incapacitated, but if they're not dead, but if the players don't check and they go to loot a non-dead player or a non-dead NPC, they're incapacitated for battle, but that doesn't mean you can't get stabbed if you start crawling on them, right?
So I have an interesting question, especially with the way we're talking about this. Initially, do you feel like some or potentially all barbarians would be immune to most or potentially all of these effects while they're raging, specifically because of the mentality
I can see that.
of
Yes, 100%. I think while raging, maybe while raging, your weakened state is like 10% or 5%. Like you have to be super, super low. And your like this other state is like 1% of your whole health. So basically it's like it's there, but it's not. You know what I mean? Like, but no, I 100% agree with that. I think someone who's raging 100% should not have that. I think there are potentially like a warlock with a certain pact, like like a pact with like the undead or something, would be perfectly unaware that they're in a weakened state or potentially going to pass out, right? Maybe, because they can't pass out. They don't even have to breathe. So, like if you're a vampire and you don't have to sleep, maybe you can't maybe you can't get knocked out. Maybe you can be incapacitated, but you can't get knocked out. Like, so I agree. Right. There are plenty of reasons why you should talk around this. It's just more of a basic approach of how to make HP represent itself. So you have the weakened state to give you some debuffs, but ways around it. You have this secondary state, which is just mainly giving you a potential chance of being knocked out, but not killed. It's for the players to have a chance to not be killed, because then the DM doesn't have to just say, oh, well, of course the bandits walk up and stab you. It's like, no, the bandits walk up and take the shit because that's what they were here to do, and then they walk away. They don't need to kill you. All they were there to do was incapacitate you, and they did. Mm-hmm. So why would they not just do that and walk away? Why would they murder you just because you fought back? That's just it. You know what I mean? You get more of a dynamic show. And then on the reverse side, the players may not have thought about incapacitating somebody, but now that they did, well, fuck, let's question them. Right? Or what if you're doing the BBEG and you thought this was a battle to the death and he goes down and you're like, holy, wait, we have a chance to capture him? Like, just,
I know you could technically always do this, but like, how does this lend to, hey, I'm in the middle of combat and I get hit and I pretend that I just
I was going to bring this up again.
Unconscious zone.
I was going to bring this up when I was talking about for DMs, right? Let's say someone goes down. They're out of combat. They can't wield their weapon. But let's say it's like a rogue or an archer or something that has a dagger on them. If they go down, but the players aren't paying attention, like players often don't, and they're not checking bodies, right? If everyone's gone down and it's like, oh, fight's over, if they don't say, does anyone look still up or awake? Like, no, everyone looks dead or passed out. Like, you don't know the difference, but everyone looks pretty much unconscious or dead. Like, you don't know, like, even if you look for breathing, you don't notice signs. But you're like, because again, metagaming, you didn't kill them all. Mm-hmm. But if you're not paying attention, you're like, okay, cool. Fight's over. All right, guys, we need to continue on. And the rogue's like, oh, I'm going to go loot the bodies real quick. Like, all right, cool. Oh, by the way, okay, you go to that one. Roll me perception. Nope. Cool. You roll. You take 6 points of damage as the body you're looting stabs you with the dagger. Because again, incapacitated doesn't mean unconscious, doesn't mean that you can't do this. It means you can't stand up and fight in a fight.
And that's the other thing, is it's like, especially if I like imagine you're fighting a rogue in battle or something like that, and he doesn't disengage, and you swing an attack of opportunity and he goes down, and you're in the middle of combat and other things are happening, so you're not gonna like go stab him or anything, and then combat's over, everything's chilling. He never went down.
Exactly. There used to be a thing called feign death, and it's a mechanic that it was a spell.
There's a spell now.
Yeah. But that's the thing. It's like, so that would lead to this, right? Because you're used to things doing that, right? Now, you don't want a DM who's going to abuse that, but adding that in once in a while, I mean, knowing that this mechanic does that, where especially if you're the DM who's hiding the HP, if you're not displaying, me, when we play and I have my whiteboard, I only ever display the HP taken. You know me. I don't ever display the max HP. I just say, this is how much HP...
This is how much damage you've done so far.
That's all they know, is how much damage they've done, because technically that's fair game. But I never tell them what they started at. So if you're the DM, if you're like me, and you only say how much damage is done, if you say an enemy goes down, what are they to believe? Either they're dead, they're knocked out or they're faking it. Now, granted, you might be the DM who does that once and now has a bunch of murder hobos on their hands where anytime someone goes down, they go over and fucking stab them 19 times. But, you know, the point being is that is another option that this brings up is doing more dynamicism like that, right? Again, just because they go down doesn't mean they're unconscious, doesn't mean that they're immobile, doesn't mean that they're not screaming their bloody head off in pain. It doesn't mean that they're not cursing the other people. It means that someone goes weakened or the incapacitated mistake. Maybe you shot again. Be dynamic with it as a maybe you had the ranger fire an arrow and the guy, you know, he's in the incapacitated state, so he's incapacitated. Maybe you state that it got him in the leg and now he can't stand and he's sitting there writhing in pain, or he's begging for his life at this point. Maybe he's sitting there he's thrown his weapons on the ground. His incapacitated state is he's prone, he's unarmed, and he's basically no longer engaging in the fight, but you're still in combat. You can still do whatever you want to him. He's just out of combat. So again, it's incapacitated, but not in the sense of completely unconscious or completely immobile. It's just that they are out of the fight. They are no longer going to fight you, regardless of, as a DM, how you want to represent that.
I always think about those old kung fu movies, or honestly, any of the like Jet Li, whatever. Like you see them like fighting all these like 20, 30, 40 dudes, and then they're all on the ground like groaning, and like none of them are dead.
Exactly, none of them are dead. But they're fighting no more. But you know what? If you walked over to one of them and had your back to him, yeah, he's probably going to try to reach for the sword, and guess what? You're going to turn around and, you know, it'd be like
I mean, how many times do you see that in the movie? Like the dude, like laying on the floor dead. Like all of a sudden, you hear a gunshot out of nowhere, and and then he picked up his gun,
right? Because you had that last moment, right? And you have moments of that, right? Maybe you have those opportunities where it's like, hey, if you're incapacitated and not unconscious, you know, maybe there's certain things like you can use like in my realm it's a DM point, other DMs use inspiration. Maybe you can use an inspiration point and you can allow them to do some sort of action while they're down. Can't attack, or maybe they can attack, but it can't be like
depending on the attack. If it's like a crossbow, you can pull a trigger, sure,
right? So maybe you do that thing where it's like you're incapacitated, you're down, and they're like, oh, can I use my DM point or can I use my inspiration? Be like, what do you want to do? Like, I have a hand crossbow and it's loaded. Like, yeah, you do. And it's like, what do you want to do with it? I'm like, I want to do that whole thing where I'm like, fuck you. And then just like before I pass out, like you could allow that, right? Those dynamic little moments,
right?
For both the players and the enemies. Both the players and the DMs can do this, right? And the idea is we don't always think about leaving enemies unconscious, but it does and should happen naturally. And this is what it will allow that. It'll allow for the dynamic plays, but it will also just allow for a less, you know, murder spree type of campaign, which ends up happening, right? You end up just leaving constant bodies behind you. But like you said, in the Kung Fu movies, this just leaves a bunch of guys beat up that now have to go to the infirmary. And all of them now have to rethink what the fuck that is that they're doing, right? And again, this can lead to, if you guys leave them alive, you can do, you know, the whole thing of a reoccurring character. You can bring one of those back and be like, I remember you. You gave me this scar. Like, you could do that, or a guy comes back with a broken arm and he's like, you changed my life. Like, losing to you, and then getting kicked out. Like, you could do so much with narration.
That leaves me.
You can even make a nemesis. You can make an arch nemesis over this. That's not even part of the plot, but just a reoccurring enemy that constantly fucks with you because you beat him up as a
that leads me to the question of could that happen to like a player? Say a player runs into a monk character or whatever, and they beat him up to 0 hit points or whatever. Like, they knock them out. What the monk beat up the player,
okay,
right?
And incapacitated them.
And so the question is, could they be well conscious? They're not bleeding out. Yeah. They're not about to die. They're just out of hit points. They're just not going anywhere. They're just fucked up.
Yeah.
And like, what would that condition look like? Like, would they have made death saving throws in a situation like that, would they have
that goes into the next stages of my plan. So I wanted to get away from negatives, right? I told you about that. But it was kind of inevitable in order to do what I really wanted to do, but I wanted to clean it up as much as I could, which is why I wanted to create the weakened state and this, potential for incapacitation state. But going back to like when it finally comes down to death, right? Starting at 0 hit points, what I wanted to do was at this point, I wanted to give death more than just I might lose my character, right? But I also didn't want to make it overly complicated every single time you die, because there's a lot of different ways to die. So what I wanted to do, and I had this idea for the critical death saves, and so I really wanted to tie all this in together. So I think I found a relatively worthwhile idea, and essentially, depending upon, and this next part's really going to depend upon the balance of combat and how much damage one takes, but it's to help balance out the critical death saves. But what I would like to do is take about 10% of your max HP, kind of like how the critical or the incapacitation state is, and put that over into the negative. So let's say out of 100 hit points, you have up to negative 10. The problem is you take so much damage that it could be very easy to go way over negative 10 very easily, but that's where we'll have to shop this. But the idea is that you have 10, maybe up to 25, but you don't want it to be that much. So it's like you have 10, like let's say 10% of your hit points into the negative. That is what I would consider the dying state. Anything beyond that is straight death. So let's say you have 100 hit points. That means you have up to negative 10. If you go straight to negative 11, you're just flat out dead, just like the book says. You have to get revived, rezzed, raised dead, some sort of actual death. But before then, you have a dying state. And this is where we talk about death saves, right? Because what I still like about death saves, the concept about death saves is it is a chance for the body to self-stabilize, right? The fact that you've been brought so far, it's not just that you got knocked unconscious, it's that your body itself, your body and your mind are fighting to live, right? They're fighting to actually stay together. Not just keep you up in battle, but actively trying not to permanently be gone. And I do like that. And I think that by adding this dying state, it still adds to the player agency of being able to get themselves up, because in the dying state, you still have a version of death saving throws that allow you to stabilize, and that'll stabilize you. You'll still be incapacitated, but you'll stabilize and you won't die without outside help. But what it also does is it also kind of puts a limit on that and says, but at the same time, there is a point to where you guys just die and you can't control it. Because I do think that when it comes to player agency, there has to be a limit, right? You don't want to have players have always, I mean, you want them to always have a choice, but you can't always have a way out. Like, that sounds bad because you always have a way out. But you know what I mean? Like, there has to be certain things where it's like, look, I'm sorry, man.
There's a way out, but there's consequences for your choices. So when you make a choice, you'll have to suffer the consequences.
Or it's just like hey, man, no matter what we can say here, I know that I always give you a choice in player agency, but let's just face it, you just took too much damage. There's just no way you can survive it, right? There's just some points where you just have to cut it off. But the reason why I like the dying state is because it does the two things. It does the opportunity for you went just beyond your 10%, right? You're actually 0, but you don't want to just outright die, like second edition says. I don't like that either. I like the idea that the body can die and essentially stabilize itself. Usually with help, right? If you're bleeding out or you're unconscious, someone will help and, go stabilize you, whether it's holding the wound or CPR. But I do like the idea that you can stabilize yourself. So what I think is best is my critical death saves, where they're indications of the three aspects of your body that are trying to survive: your body, physically, your mind, and your overall fortitude moving forward. The strength, intelligence, and constitution. I like the idea of replacing the straight 3 rolls of death saves with these 3. But you, instead of having all of these weird situations of when you do these, I like the idea that if you're in the dying state, that's when you roll these. Because if you've gone fully on to death, that's basically it. You just gone fully on to death. So if you're going to get brought back, you get brought back, like the book says, as is, like as you were. But if you've pulled yourself back from death, the idea is that a near-death experience like that you've pulled yourself back from is probably going to have some sort of consequence, right? Some sort of defect moving forward. And I'm not talking about like hugely class-changing, character build-changing defects, but you are going to suffer a little bit, just like if you had a car accident, you're going to not necessarily walk away in 100% one piece. So that's where I'm kind of wanting to balance out my critical death saves.
Are these the ones where you would implement the things that we were talking about on Monday?
Yes.
Like where you could potentially, I don't know, go blind or lose your hearing or all that stuff. Like,
yeah, depending on
but
the
those
severity.
are the game changing ones that you said.
Those could be game changing if you do like all your critical fails, like if you just fail all of your rolls. But we're talking about things more like you could gain a limp and then maybe lose like one space of movement. So instead of having 6 spaces of movement or 30 feet, you can only get 25. Like changing, but not to the point to where it's like, it would be a very massive situation for like a wizard to not be able to cast magic, but I don't want it to be that game changing unless it's like extreme, but it's just more of a,
the extreme situations, they'd usually be dead and they wouldn't have to do this save anymore.
Yeah. So the idea is, like, let's say you have, trying to think, I had examples before, but yeah, so going back to explain what we talked about on Monday. So the idea is that once you've been put into the dying state, you basically have 5 rounds before you're absolutely dead. Mm-hmm. So the idea would be you get put into the dying state, you're below 0, but you're not fully dead. You're basically out. You can't do anything. You have 5 rounds for someone to come get you, but you also have the new death saves, right? So you have the first 3 rounds to stabilize yourself, and if you don't, you have 2 rounds for someone to stabilize you or you die. And then at that point, you're dead. You have to get whatever means to come back.
Right.
So the saving throws go like this. You have for the first 3 rounds, you're going to make each round a series of 3 rolls. For 5th edition, we're going to talk about 5th edition because most people don't really know how my stat rolls really work. So we'll just use 5th edition logic. So for round 1, you're going to make 3 rolls. You're going to make a strength DC check, an intelligence, and a constitution. And the DC for this one will be 15 because normal DC is we talked about is 10 for just like a regular
for flat
check.
death saves.
So because the flat death save is 10, each of these are going to be 15 because it's going to be a little bit harder to pass these.
Right.
And again, it's only in this particular state, so it's only when you're specifically in the dying state. And so the idea is that round 1, 2, and 3, you're going to make each one, all 3 of these, up to 3. And the idea is that you have 3 rounds to basically successfully make one of each. So let's say round 1, you make your strength DC and your intelligence DC, but you fail your constitution. You have 2 more rounds to succeed in your constitution. You don't have to roll the other ones. You just have to succeed in all 3 once, but you have 3 rounds to do it. But the idea is that for every round you don't succeed one of the rolls, that's going to lead into one of the like deficiencies you have. So again, strength would be something related to physical, your physicalness. Your intelligence would be something related to the way your mind works, and constitution would be like hit point adjustments or the way your body reacts, right? And then the more you lose, that's where you could get like, let's say you go all 3 rounds and you fail all 3. Maybe that's where you go blind. You know what I mean? Like it's that's the super extreme
right.
like effect of you died.
So I guess my question is, so it feels like with the change of when it occurs, it feels like it's changing a little bit more from a critical death to more of like, I don't want to call it a gentle death, but it's more of like the less damage you take, the more likely you're going to have to roll these rolls.
I guess yes, and that's probably going to be something that we have to discuss over time, because it's like, we could still make the critical death where maybe if you don't go into the dying, like, because the idea is that, like, you still have to have kind of that cutoff of when you just die, right? There's always going to be some sort of cutoff when you just flat out die. I do like some sort of intermediate where you can stabilize and kind of just, you're out for the count, but people can come and get you up later. But somewhere along those lines, and then again, more so, I still like the idea of a step down before that, right? Not just straight from I'm in the battle to now I'm dead,
right?
Or now I like the step down, but somewhere along the line, I feel like there has to be the chance, not a guarantee. That's why I didn't want to put it everywhere, but there's got to be somewhere along the lines that just by going into this incapacitated state or going into this dying state, it has to stick with you, right? Like that idea of, I can't just die and die and die in every combat and have this guy res me, or go to this church and pay them money, or drink this potion. Like, to me, I want the idea that one of these, like not every death. I want the idea of one of your deaths. You need to walk away remembering that death.
That's kind of getting back to the question I was asking earlier. Is, if that monk is beating me up, he's not putting me in a state where I'm about to die. I'm just writhing on the floor in pain,
like incapacitated, right? Yeah.
But like but my hit points went to 0. And so I'm not unconscious. I'm just hurt. I'm incapacitated. I'm not going anywhere.
0 hit points would start the dying stage.
But see, that's my question. So where does that medium come in? Like, where in this process can we get to the point where you're one of the goons on the ground that's not dying, that's just hurt?
You could be at 1 hit point.
So that's what you're saying. Those people are only the 1 hit point people.
They're within the 10%. So that's the 10%, right? So if they have 100 hit points, if they've gotten down to 8 hit points, but they failed that check, they're now just writhing on the ground. They're completely done. They're not dead. They have hit points left, but they're out for the count. They are done with the battle. Like you said, they're the Kung Fu guys, just done.
The way, in my mind, and I don't know how you see this unfolding. Like, say if we were to like play out one of those Kung Fu scenes where I walk into another person's martial arts studio and I want to challenge all of their people, but I don't want to kill any of them.
Yeah.
I don't want to kill any of them, right? How would I go about entering into that combat knowing that I'm not going to kill any of them, and they're only going to be on the ground, and they're never going to have to make that saving throws?
I said earlier that's where good that you brought that up, because I had mentioned this earlier, and this is where I was trying to make a point. This is where I think that we as DMs need to encourage players, and we need to encourage the practice that stuff needs to be called out as early as the start of combat, because a lot of the times I feel like that decision is either made late in the game, or it's been made, but no one brings it up until you're about to kill the final boss.
Right.
Or kill the guy. You're like, no. Don't kill him. Remember, non-lethal. And it's almost like you have to say it at that hit. It's almost like you can't do any damage if you're saying non-lethal. And I think that's the problem, is because you think of HP as lethality.
Yeah.
And that's my mindset that I want to change. Is I want people to walk in going, like, if you want to tell me, bro, I'm a pacifist, I will fight if I need to, but I do not kill. I would love a character or player to do that, because at that point, we never have to talk about it again. You essentially never drop them below 1 HP. It's hard mechanically to do because every attack has enough damage, but you don't have to deal all the damage you roll. That's what's called pulling a punch. The dice roll is the maximum amount of damage that punch can do. Your max is a D6. That punch is a 4 out of 6, which means you can do a D6 worth of damage. That punch you threw can only do a max of 4. But when you say, I want to do non-lethal damage, you can say, I want that 4 to be a 1.
Because all they need is one more.
Mechanically you don't. You don't tell me.
And you
don't say, hey, I did 7 damage. I only want to do 3.
But you're saying non-lethal damage. So if it goes over, then you're going to calculate up until the 1.
You pulled that punch, because the idea is in the middle of battle, you're going to be like, bow. You're not down. Bow. Okay, you're down. Like you're going to kind of see it in there, right? Like the idea is that if you're trying to go for non-lethal combat, your character's paying attention to everything, right? You're not just going to suddenly go, man, this guy is, oh, fuck, he's dead. Like, you know what I mean? Like, unless you're just so engaged in some sort of massive battle, if you've walked into it going, he's not going to die, I just need to knock him out.
I honestly
should
think
take that into account.
The only exceptions to that, again, going back to the barbarian, when you're in that rage, you ain't and maybe you ain't even thinking about non-lethal.
How about a simple situation? Hey, barbarian, you can't non-lethal when you're raging. You don't have the choice, right? That dice roll is the maximum amount of damage you're putting out. But but like you were saying, if you wanted to walk in and say, hey man, I'm walking into this dojo, I'm challenging everyone, but I don't want to kill anyone. All right, done. From that point on, that is not a killing blow that you will ever do in that battle. And me as a DM, I like that. I want that. I want players to say, hey, how many enemies are on the table? You're against 6. That guy, the big bad guy, he doesn't die. If you just say that at the beginning of combat, let the combat unfold as everything. And even if someone gets that magical crit hit at the very end, and you're like, hey bro, you're going to take him down, and I know you don't want to do non-lethal, but hey, that crit, that was going to take him down. How do you want to do it? Like, it doesn't ever, nothing else has to change. But if you know specifically that all of the characters are involved saying that one doesn't die, just don't let, like, you can control the hit points. You don't have to go over what they are. And if you give this 10%, it also gives DMs a slightly bigger buffer on when to knock them out. Or when to fold into that. It's not just when they're at 0. Like, again, you don't have to keep this mindset that you have to go to 0 hit points. No, sorry guys, he has 1 hit point. You're not done. You still have to. Why?
Yeah.
Just let the dude admit defeat, right? Like, not all characters, not all NPCs have to do that, right? Some NPCs can just fight to the death. But some NPCs have self-worth, and if they're at 2 hit points, why not just let them give up? You know what I mean? Like, I just feel like if we have these like small little states to trigger those opportunities, it's not to say that DMs aren't smart enough, but we all forget in the middle of combat. It's nice to just be like, oh guys, here's where we are.
It's definitely something that I would say
Cosmic's here.
Needs to be reminded. And like, when there's a mechanic for it, when there's something to like actually pay attention to, I love, like, it makes it that much easier for it to be something like, hey, this is something that anytime you make a rule for something, it's something that we're saying, hey, I want this to be in the forefront of your mind. I want you to pay attention to this. I want this to be something that your attention goes to, so that we can make sure X, Y, and Z happens, or whatever the case may be. And so that's what we're trying to do is here, hey, let's make sure our attention goes to the fact that you are now this close to death, so that X, Y, and Z can happen, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, exactly. So again, that's some of the things I'm trying to solve with this. I mean, it's not a perfect system. I will admit that. It's not a perfect system.
It's developing. That's exactly.
But going back to like what you said on Monday about, we were trying to really talk about like the critical death saves and whether or not it makes sense. Like, when does it make sense to trigger them? And I feel like if you're in this dying state, again, I understand what you were saying, where technically the less damage you take, the more likely you are, but that's not necessarily true. You could take 20 points of damage when you have 15, and you could take 20 points of damage when you have 2.
Yes.
And those will be the one will be dead and one will be dying. So technically, it's only true when you're already that low.
Yes.
But it's not overall true. And that's why it gives you, if you take all that damage, if you're at 15, 20 damage and you take that 30 points, you're technically not dead. And I like that. I like that little bit of a buffer where you still aren't dead. You have a chance of revival. But again, I feel like with these kind of rolls, with this chance of you have to make these 3 DC checks and you have 3 rounds to make 1 each. You just have to make them one time. The idea is that hopefully a lot of the times you're just going to bounce right back, right? But and maybe you just make a house rule. 1 fail does nothing. You have to have at least 2 fails, either of the same category or of one of each, to get a debuff, right? There's a lot of different ways to balance it. But the idea is, what I want is, I want them to fear death more than just losing their character, right? There has to be something. And I think as a dynamic, both narratively and roleplay wise, for a character to have that 1 death, think about it, that 1 death that they remember.
So
One death that they can't forget, not just because it was spectacular or
have-
cinematic, but because they still like think about this. Think about, you could do something narratively like, hey, fighter, you died. You missed 2 of your strength checks before you stabilized. And what had ended up happening was blah, 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 due to this fight. You said you were right-handed? Good. You lost 2 of your fingers. You now can't hold a sword in your right hand. So narratively, nothing really changes. You just, narratively in the background, they spent weeks training. They've learned to be left-handed. But the point is now that character shouldn't fundamentally change. Like, you can write it into the character that they overcame that. But imagine that is now they're a left-handed fighter because of that death. That's now something stuck with their character.
So, as we were talking earlier about the weakened state and a lot of other stuff, I was thinking a lot about really, really cool things that we can do with spells interacting with these states now. Right? Like, and I have some really cool ideas of stuff that we can do with that. But I was also thinking about the death saves as well. And I have this inclination to want to say that it is hard or impossible to have a spell affect death saving throws. And what I mean by that is like to say, hey, I cast a spell that I created a spell that gives me advantage on all my death saving throws, or something like that, or all my, all the Constitution or whatever, like my inclination is to say that like those things, because generally speaking, in 5th edition as it stands, I think there was 1 or 2 effects in the entire game that actually interact with death saving throws. There's really not a lot that does anything to affect what you can or can't do with those things. Like, I think they say that the Paladin's aura, where it gives you a +1 to all your saving throws, it will...
There's one that gives you an advantage on death saves too.
Yes, and that's the other one that I'm thinking of. But like outside of that, like that's about it.
Right.
And so just the idea of what you can do, of how spells can so significantly change the game and almost make certain things like obsolete, like making it so much harder to do things with that. But think about if I created a healing spell that could just heal you back to your above your weakened state or something, like, or when you get weakened, or shoot, having like a contingency spell that triggers when you get on your weakened, like all these different types of spell interactions.
This also brings
us
up something that we kind of glanced over. So I did say that the death state, the dying state, would be 5 rounds. The first 3 are your chance to stabilize. Now, if someone gets to you within those 5 rounds, even the round 1 before you get to do your rolls, they can stabilize you. And the idea is whether you're bleeding out, they'll stop the bleeding. Whether you're unconscious, they kind of like pat you away. There's things that they can do to help you. But going into that too, like you were saying, there's not a lot that goes with death saving throws. But with this one, you can make it more dynamic, right? Like, let's say you're dying and someone says, hey, I'm going to force feed them a potion, or I'm going to throw like, healing touch or whatever, or what is it?
Healing word.
Yeah, healing word, right? Just to kind of boost them real quick. Now, one, if it only is going to boost them like 1d4 and they're 5 in the negative, doesn't really help them, right? But you could do a dynamic where it's like, hey, what are you healing them with? Healing word, that's physical, mostly physical damage that it heals. Or you could say this, hey, you don't have enough to bring them to 0, or maybe you do. Like, maybe you could say, hey, if you're in the dying state, you can only be brought to 1, but you can't be brought up from the dying. Like, you could do something like that.
I kind of like that. Yeah, that way people aren't just...
You can't just be up and out. But here's the other thing, too. What if you also said, hey, any healing that you do can only bring them up to 1. So if they're -1 or -10, you can only bring them up to 1. And that means they're still in their incapacitated state. But what if the dying state doesn't end? But either based on the type of healing that you give them, or the healer gets a choice. Not only can you bring them as much up to 1, but you can negate one of the saves they have to make. So like you could say, hey, I'm a healer. I'm going to heal him. I can only give him 4. So either he's going to stay in the negative or he's going to go up to 1. But he doesn't have to make his Constitution check. Because like you said, with 5th edition, let's say his Constitution has a -2 and he has to make a DC 15.
Right.
If I heal him, the healing stops him. He still has to, the dying state is still the body stabilizing.
Right.
So the healing will help bring him to the 1, but he still has to make the saves unless someone physically stabilizes him, right? Because like, I like the idea of not physically like, I like the idea of not magically taking him out of the dying state, but being able to help him along.
I do like the fact that the idea that you still have to make the checks even when you even if you get your hit points back,
or if someone stabilizes you, like someone can come over and stabilize you, but maybe all they can do is recover. Like again, if they're helping you, the bleeding, you don't have to make your strength, or they say, hey, I'm going to do CPR, so he doesn't have to make his intelligence because I'm keeping blood flowing. You whatever you want to say in the moment. But the idea is whoever stabilizes you or whoever casts a healer on you, whatever happens, whatever that person is, they can take 1 of your saves away within the first 3 rounds. And then otherwise they have 2 rounds to prevent you from dying. But the first 3 rounds are what are you going to lose? What debuff will you take permanently because your body, went through all of that.
Got it.
So these are the things that they're trying to solve,
right?
right?
Yeah. No, I definitely like that. I like that.
And it sounds, I think, complicated like initially, but realistically speaking, we're talking about a trigger to be weakened, a trigger to potentially be knocked unconscious, a small window to have permanent loss, and then anything beyond that's death. Like, that's, in a nutshell, that's all we're really doing. We just haven't nailed down exactly what all the debuffs and everything are going to be.
Right.
But that's not necessarily something that I care to nail down. It's more where you and I would be much more dynamic and let the combat and the actions decide that. But this is the foundation that I think the future of High Point will lead into this. Instead of having the unconscious and dead zones that I used to have, I think having this weakened state, this state that can potentially, I gotta find a better name for it, but the potential to go unconscious.
I was just thinking of like knockout zone or something, like, because I mean, technically you're just getting knocked out or unconscious or something like that. Like it's the
yeah, we gotta find it. Yeah, we'll find out, because I want a catchy name. You gotta have this cool catchy name.
Because the only thing I'm thinking of is like the monks leaving all of the goons, and so I'm just thinking about calling it the goon state. Like you're just a freaking goon and you just get knocked unconscious, or
yeah,
that's what you get for being a scrub.
And yeah, and I'll keep working on this idea of once you're beyond your hit points, like I feel like there should be a window where you can survive, and then there's going to be a window where you can't. But that survival window, I really think it deserves. And again, critical death saves, I think, are going to have multiple iterations, because not only do I want them in this dying state, but I do want certain situations. But because again, you don't want them to happen too often, but you do want certain deaths to feel more potent, right? You don't just want some peasant or some thief who ambushed you to make you permanently have a limp or go potentially deaf in one ear. But I mean, I'm saying, though, there are some times that there are just deaths where you just pop back and you're just like, let's go. And it's like, what? Like, you don't need, you didn't even decide to have a scar. You didn't lose a finger.
Okay.
Like, come
so
on.
When it comes to that, what about whenever you get put into the death zone or the dying zone, however far into the negative you went, when you get healed back, you lose that from your max hit points. That's something. Even if you don't get a whatever.
But see, that's where, in my opinion, that's where the Constitution check comes in. Because if you fail your Constitution save during the critical, you most likely what ends up happening is you lose permanent HP.
And that's fair. That's fair.
That would just that would just be my.
But if you're looking for an all the time consequence, like anytime you go down, it needs to cost you something.
See, I don't want that, though. I don't necessarily want. I want to prevent a every time, because I don't want every death, because it is D&D, right? There is still
for sure
an aspect of it is D&D. Death is still going to happen. I want people to not brush off death so easily and only think, well, I'm either going to lose my character or I'm not. I want them to approach death at a step down. I want them to approach death, right? I don't want death to be welp, if he hits, I'm dead. Or, oh, that was more damage I was expecting, I'm dead.
Yeah.
I want an approach to death. I want an understanding that death is on its way. And I want a fear that this death could be worse. Like, I basically want an opportunity for something to be worse than death. Like, we've always heard that, right? There are some things worse than death.
Yeah.
Having a mage, like we've talked about, like failing 3 times on intelligence and 1 time on strength. And maybe you interpret that as now you have a stutter. So you have a 5% chance of fucking up a spell. So 5% chance you'll fail your spell anytime you cast one. Small, not game-changing, kind of like a curse.
Yes.
But kind of like, bro, you died. Like, you took a fireball to the face.
It would be nice. It would be really interesting, especially with something like that. Like, say it's only 5%. It almost never goes off. You're just sitting there. You almost forget about it. Yeah, you roll your dice. Yeah, everything's fine. Yeah, you roll your dice. Yeah, everything's fine. Yeah, you roll your... Holy shit. That was the last fireball I needed to kill the...
Yep, that one time you fucking stuttered.
And it didn't...
You know what I'm saying? Like, or, yeah. Oh, dude, like, imagine... this would be even worse, but imagine you... Like, again, imagine they failed all their strength ones, like all their strength saves. And you basically did like, yeah, man. So you messed up your hand, Doctor Strange messed up your hands, and you can no longer cast any spell that requires
with somatic components.
So imagine something like that. You can still cast spells, just not somatic.
You would have to multi-class into sorcerer and get subtle spell, and every single one you would have to use your meta magic to cast subtle spell.
But how cool is that? Like, again, I know a lot of players would be like, well, that's fucked up, that's not what I want in my character, but it's like, that's where I think we need to be more open with. You players affect the game world needs to affect the players, and instead of railroading them into it, and that's having this system in place that is understandably, like, it puts your characters at risk, but fundamentally so,
okay,
right? Or justifiably so, I should say.
If here's my thought process. I'm totally down for that if the DM is also willing to allow that person to go down a road to find a creative solution to the problem that they've been presented with. Hypothetically speaking, you're Doctor Strange. You can't cast somatic components anymore. All right, well, Fireball has a somatic component, but I still really want to be able to cast Fireball. I want to learn to find a way to find a version of Fireball I can cast without somatic components, or I want to create another spell that does the same general effects.
And so in High Point, obviously, it could be as simple as, okay, well, you can't do the somatical component, and some DMs would be like, well, you could just find a wand of Fireball. But see, what I would go is one step further, be like, okay, you can't do somatical with your hands, but you can hold a wand. There are plenty of mages who use wands. So, because if you think about it, right, you can use a focus. So, in game, how do you think I explain? Well, if you're a wizard who has a wand as their focus, and this wizard doesn't, how do I explain your somatical components? You're holding a wand. How do you have the exact same somatic that he does? It's not one-handed. It's a multitude of things, right? The way you explain that away is there's a different somatic with a wand than there is with hands. So it's not as simple as, well, I just pick up a wand and now I can do that. There would be a learning curve. There would be some sort of way that you have to relearn this, but maybe you have to do maybe just force them to redo the whole spell. Now you just have to relearn a new Fireball. But yes, I would say that I wouldn't say there's always a way around it, but 99% of the time there should be something that you can do. It should not be such a detriment that it literally levels their entire progress. But I don't think that you should be afraid to put an obstacle in their way, like a 5% chance for a mage to fuck up, or taking their hands away, or making someone deaf in their left ear or something like that. Like, just do something that, it's going to suck. It's going to cause some sort of trouble, but that's the point. It's supposed to be.
Yes.
And again, I don't want this every death. I don't want every death to feel like fuck every time. It's not supposed to be a dungeon crawler game where every time you die, it gets harder. It's just that once in a while, you need to remember death is a thing, and fighting to the death Like
I would
the mindset
also-
that fighting to one hit point every single combat just because that's the game. I don't want to encourage that. I honestly, I don't want to say that I want people running away, but I want to encourage them to be like, maybe we should back out of this and come back prepared. Like, I feel like there's more dynamic that can happen in a lot of combat and just in a lot of narratives with these campaigns. If you had these benchmarks instead of just the mindset of, all right, until everyone's at 0, go. That's the one thing I just really don't like about combat is it's literally until they're at 0, we're going to keep fighting. And it's like, is that really how combat always works until everyone's dead?
Yeah. I really think giving when things aren't so detrimental that it derails everything, cuz like imagine like I am the mage of the party, right? And we're about to go stop this BBEG, and we need to cast a spell in order to do it. There's a ritual, and I have to do this. I just lost my hands. Now I can't do this. Now we have to derail absolutely everything we're doing to go get me some hands. You know what I mean? Like, if...
I mean, as bad as that sounds, though, I mean, is that any... Like, I know that players, like, say, like, oh, yeah, that's going to suck because, like, it derails us. It's like, yeah, but you guys don't mind when you derail the DM. Like, you don't mind when you undo his plans. Like, so to me... That's just more narrative, though, right? That's just...
It is if everyone's on board, but if one person, now everyone has to stop what they're doing to just go deal with this one person. Like,
I mean, I to me, that if that's a problem, it's coming down to how it's being narrated and how the story is unfolding, right? Because if everyone's being upset that they're not able to do what they want to do because it's one thing, it's like they're either being not led as a party, or their narration is being said, hey, by the way, fuck you, I'm stopping everything that you want. Like, to me, those problems are solved by, like you said, everyone has to be on the same page. But that's everyone, including the DM, really making the narration work like that, right? Like, if you feel like you can't do something because someone else got in your way, to me, that's more likely the DM making it seem like they're allowing that player and that character to take a lead of the story.
Well, I mean, like,
incorporating the
hypothetically speaking, like, if it just made sense because of everything that's happening, right? Like, logically in your world, where you would need to go to get these hands is in some other planet somewhere. Just so happens that you can't find it in this plane of existence, right? And so where you guys were headed, you guys are almost there. You guys are like the next town over. And now you have to go on this potentially, who knows how long, like it could be a 10-year journey to go find these hands. And who knows, it could literally mean the end of the planet just because now I don't have enough time to go get these hands and stop the ritual.
I see where...
And it was just because it made sense in the time.
But see, that's again, and this is just, I think, the difference in approach for DMs, because I think that when you're dealing with a campaign base, I can understand how that's difficult because everyone has expectations of that. But for me in High Point, that never becomes a problem. Like, everything in High Point is your one and only opportunity, right? Like, I mean, like take Old Gods, right? Like when you got the lyre. When you guys actually solved that puzzle and got the lyre, that was only a one option. That was only a one attempt. Like, if you guys had failed that was it. That there wasn't going to be like oh, well, you could potentially, or there's multiple ways. It's like in High Point, like there are, for me as a DM, the way that I do like to run things is there are some things that are just, you're going to get that one shot.
Oh, I totally get that. But imagine, hey, I've been working for the past 3 months, a year in game, working towards this end, right? And I just so happen to trip and fall and have to roll on this critical roll table, and now I'm whatever the case may be, and now everything that I've been working for, because I made a pit stop in this town to go get some apples.
I mean, again, it's if the player's feeling like that's unfair, then I would feel like I've failed as a DM the narration, because I mean, it's never happened to me that way, but I don't foresee that becoming a problem, because like we've talked about, it's all about the player agency, right? I don't think I would ever represent it or present it in a way that makes them feel like, oh, this just got thrown onto me and now everything I've ever planned for is done for. Like, to me, that's a failure on the DM. If you're feeling that way, like if you're getting something handed to you that makes you feel that way, even towards me, even if one of my players came to me and felt that way, I would take it as a failure on my part. Because to me, that is either I have, the DM has not properly represented how the DM, because like I feel like I represent High Point in that can happen. And everyone knows that can. But if you do feel unjustified, that may have been me not prompting enough warnings, because like we've talked about before, it's simple for a DM to be like, hey, cool if you do this, just know it could, like, if I knew that you were going to do something that could literally derail something that big, that's on me if I'm not going to tell you about it or give you a warning or any of that, right? Like, I feel like I'm not going to maybe blatantly say you could lose the working of your hands, but you know what I mean? Like, to me, if it's that critical to the campaign or the plot,
yes,
it's there's going to be a work up to it. And that's, again, some of the things that I do in High Point because of these situations, right? I'm very aware that some things are extreme in High Point. I totally understand that outcomes and punishments and consequences can be extreme in High Point, especially when we have a evolving open world, right? Where it's not like we're playing sessions where we can go back and replay that campaign and talk to that NPC a different way and try a different thing, right? Like, that's not how I work. And I'm comfortable with that. It's taken me a lot of years to get comfortable with that. But I do take that into account. I totally understand what you're saying. And in response to you, it's more of my response to other DMs to solve that is to be aware of what you're doing in the moment versus what you're planning, because there are two different times where you're like, oh, this sounds good in the moment, but you haven't thought it all the way through.
And that's a really hard thing to do. And in those
moments, again, that's player and DM have to both make a decision on who they are. I've retconned things. And there are some things that I've stood pat on, even though you've made a very good argument to me on maybe why I could be wrong or maybe why it wasn't the best move. And we've had our disagreements about that in High Point. Again, the things about being a DM, you have to learn how to set your boundaries. But there's other things we've retconned, we've stepped back on and been like, oh, no, you're right. I was wrong on that one, or, you caught me in where I was misquoting myself. And you have to be comfortable knowing which one is which. I would absolutely admit fault. And like, again, going back to your situation, I'd admit fault. I'd say, hey, that's on me. Depending on the situation, if it wasn't, if it was one of those situations where I'm like, okay, that's on me, I didn't warn you enough, but that is just how the game works, versus okay, no, that one, I see, if you really knew, you wouldn't have done that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
There's those moments where you have to understand, like, look, man, you would have done this regardless, even if you had the warning. I'm sorry, that's how the game works. I'm sorry you didn't know, but really you were going to do this. Like, this is what you were doing. Versus shit, no, if I had warned you, you wouldn't.
Yeah.
And again,
there are definitely players who try and work the system. I guess a lot of
You're absolutely right in your fear, though.
Yeah.
That's a very valid concern, and this is why these kind of rules aren't going to be meant for everyone, right? This isn't,
and that's
like
true. But there
isn't...
is a way to, like, be aware of it, as if it is something that you are looking to implement. It's like, hey, there are some potential pitfalls, right. Like, hey, just make sure that when you're approaching these things, that sometimes you can recognize, all right,
but here's
this, like you said a second ago, it sounds cool in the moment, but how is this going to affect not only my player, but the entire story and everybody else down the line?
And here's another aspect to that, though, too, is looking at it from that point of view as well. It always comes back to what we always talk about, is what kind of gaming group are you guys? Because are you, like, let's face it, there's two roughly different types. There's the type that play for the story and the type that play for the game. The type that play for the game are the type of gaming groups, both players and DMs, who TPK, kill off, write new character. Like, they're the ones that are doing a lot of stuff. And then there are the ones who play for the story, the ones that literally get mad if you TPK, like in these situations. And so it's like where I see you have valid concerns. I think one of the reasons why, at least in a High Point mindset, I'm okay to not worry so much, is because also, as valid as your concerns are, like, man, what if we were right there and the mage loses its hands and we get derailed? I'm like, that's fair. That would be frustrating. But at the same time, you had to be in combat, get into your dying state, fail your rolls spectacular, like all three of your rolls 3 times, Like the idea that, again, I want to balance it, so I'm putting all of these barriers to the fact that if all of that fell into place, tough titties. You know, like just in the sense of, I totally get where you're coming from, and it's not invalid. But in high point mindset, I feel like I'm balancing this enough to where I'm like, the fact that you got to that point and then you're still crying, but now I can't do what it's basically, and what I'm trying to say is, this isn't not what you're saying.
No.
But what I'm trying to protect against is, so basically what you're saying is, don't ever let me crit fail. Because that's fucking stupid. Like, and you're not saying that. I'm not trying to get, but
very much so.
My mindset is, if you're in your example, in just the one example of, hey, what if we were right about a big turning point and this happened? And I'm like, you're telling me that in the grand scheme of your campaign, you got all the way there, did something you weren't planning on doing, got into a bad situation, got into the dying state, failed your rolls, still lived, and the debuff, the combination that you did just happened to inspire me to give you a debuff that also fucked your campaign. Like, I'm not saying it's unlikely, but I'm just saying that, like, for all of that to happen, I'm also kind of one of those DMs where I'm like, that's a lot of stars coming into line. You're basically saying, don't let me get that nat 1 right now because we're going to fail. Like, there's the point of, yes, we always want to be the great heroes. We always want our cinematic stuff. But at the same time, there's a little bit of tough titties.
I will say that in my experience with you as a DM, I am much less concerned about this issue arising. But it is a concern that I bring up because as much as I enjoy gaming with you, I have gamed in a lot of other areas and with a lot of other DMs, and I bring up issues that I see as potential problems because I've seen them occur. I've seen DMs who they fly by the rule of cool, but it's their own rule of cool. It's like, if what I'm doing seems cool to me, I'm gonna do it, and I don't really care how it affects you. You know what I mean? And so. And sometimes they do it because they don't even care how it affects the story, you know. They
just want a cool narrative in the moment. They just want to seem like they know what they're doing. And I agree with you. Like these kind of roles that I come with High Point, I know wouldn't be massively popular in a D&D module book, right? I think a lot of my ideas could very well improve D&D as a whole, but ideas like this are probably not for the masses, not because DMs can't use it or whatever. It's just to properly balance it and properly get everyone on board. It does take a unique dynamic of a gaming group. It takes a strong DM. Yep. This idea is not fleshed out nearly enough to give people a white page or a blank sheet and go, here's a template. And
run with it, yeah.
Because the thing is like, the one thing that D&D and the books do, we're all about beyond the book, but one thing that the books do amazingly is give you that template that works out of the box. So our ideas are great when implemented, but some assembly required.
Yes.
Like this idea. Until we could flesh out everything to where the template works as is without modification, not necessarily perfectly,
which is what we're trying to do with stuff like homebrew, like with my druid subclass. Like, I'm trying to get it set up so that it does work out the box. So when we talk about things and like, hey, this is a potential out the box issue. Like, whenever any video game comes out, a lot of people don't buy it for the first couple months because there's going to be bugs in it and they're going to have all these fixes and like
exploits and all of that kind of stuff.
All of that stuff. So it's how are you gonna mitigate those things when you're setting it up in the first place? And we're doing, like, that's what this is. This is the, hey, how we're gonna, mentally metagame, play test it to figure out, hey, these are the potential ways you could break it. These are the potential ways it could feel broken to the people that are receiving it, all of the above. So it's very interesting mindset that we bring to the table, because you're going to have to deal with, again, like you said, it very much depends on your gaming group. It depends on the type of people that are playing with it. You this type of gameplay, this type of interaction with death is important for you. A lot of people that play want to just have a respawn game, and they just want to be able to hack and slash. That's why some people like 4th edition, and they want something that feels very plug and play.
I mean, yeah, like Baldur's Gate, you know, being a video game, did a good job at making it pretty cheap to just res any of your down party members as long as the whole someone in the party survived.
Honestly, you can cheese that too. Apparently, you can pickpocket the dude that you pay, and just like.
Oh, it's free. Yeah, no, you totally just pickpocket them and it's totally free.
Right, whatever, it's fine.
No, and so yeah, so that's the whole thing is like out the box. This isn't fleshed out yet, but this is the direction High Point's going because I feel like it's fixing the dynamicism issue with hit points. It's fixing the representation of the current state that the character is in, and I'm trying to still, as we're talking about, fix the. What does death mean ongoing? Like, why can you die so many times? And maybe we could even talk about, like, maybe this doesn't even kick in until, like, the 3rd time you've been downed to 0 hit points. Maybe after the 3rd time, then you start having a dying state. Just the whole point is, again, I want dying to stop feeling like it's or I want it to, as you approach it, you have a fear that I could walk away worse off than just dying. And I like that. Yeah. And I love the idea of every character having just that one death that they went through that they're like,
never again, man.
Man, you know what happened? Like, I still can't do such and such. Like, I'm still limited to jumping only 5 feet. I can't do my 10-foot jump anymore. Or, you know, I can only move 4 squares instead of like just something small, not majorly game changing, but just something small. You know, having a character who maybe their whole thing isn't ranged based, but maybe they do carry a bow. Maybe they die and they lose their strength checks, so maybe they cannot handle a longbow. That's it. That's their only limitation is they cannot draw a longbow. The draw power and the motion just fucks with them. So that's all. They're not like a ranger. They're not like that wasn't like their entire build. But you're just like, hey man, longbows too strong for you. Short bows and that's it. Crossbows, short bows, or just no bow. Like you can do crossbows, but you can't draw a bow. Like you just do something like that where it's like that's kind of your thing. Because you know, the thing I want to do after this, I don't want to incorporate this yet, but what I want to do after this is we talked about critical death saves, and we're kind of getting away from that. I still kind of want something like that because that's still a cool concept of not just this dying state, but you know, something that is critical that really like puts you over. But later, once we've kind of fleshed this out, one thing I would really like to look at is how do we implement the same type of essentially permanent damage or permanent debuff to a one-time like damage take. Like,
like the massive hit.
Yeah, because like in 2nd edition, they have a rule where if at any point a character takes 50 points or more of damage in a single hit, not a cumulative, but in a single hit, takes more than 50 or more points, they're dead. It's just an automatic kill. Like 50 points of damage. Or no, I'm sorry. They have to make a death saving throw. So they actually make a save versus death. And have a chance of, and that save versus death is basically a system shock. It's whether or not the body can survive dying or survive that much damage. So I eventually, when we kind of flesh out these, you know, the weakened zone and all of that, I eventually want to work that back in where we have essentially like an instant incapacitation amount of damage that will just knock you right into the dying state or whatever. And then what amount of damage makes sense for just basically you're dead. Like, you know, how much damage can you really take before it's just you're just dead.
Yeah.
Like, doesn't matter how much HP you have. That much damage just, or a save throw or something like that. So those are the next ideas that I will work at. My battery just died. That's probably a good time. But yeah, so that's what I'm eventually going to work on. But that right now, I think this is kind of the areas that I want to focus on and kind of fix up. Wow, it is really dark over here all of a sudden.
Cool.
Man, that looks so much different. Well, Cosmic isn't here. Oh, hey, Cosmic, you are here. Good. I wanted to check you in, make sure you were here in chat and right when we finished up to answer your question. So we got a Cosmic, or we got a Cosmic from a question. We got a question from Cosmic. He says that for the next name that I say, which weapon type comes to mind for a homebrew name? for this homebrew game. So when I say this homebrew game, what weapon type first comes to your mind? I already know I have 2 in mind, but he's just curious about what we both think. So when you hear Umbral Ember's Descent, what is the weapon type that comes to mind?
Umbral Ember's Descent.
There's 2 things that instantly come to mind. The first, I think it's my brain's not working. Is it the not quite a gauntlet, but like a greave? The greave is like the metal like arm that you basically like punch with.
Yeah. Gauntlets is fair enough.
The gauntlet's more of like the metal like just protective, but I'm thinking of the one that you actually fight with, like the.
Oh, like
I just forget what they're called. But they're like not like bracers. But, But yeah, they're just
kind of like that. Yeah.
But yeah, like that. They're meant to be fought with. So it's like either those.
Are you talking about tonfas? Those like wooden. They can be wooden or they can be metal. They have like a handle sticking out of them, kind of like the police batons.
No. This is just like more like it's like a gauntlet, but it's like
it actually wraps around your hands,
and it's supposed to actually be for like melee combat. But it's like a gauntlet designed for that.
I'd have to think of the name.
But I think of that or Umbral Embers. For that, or I think of like it just reminds me of either that or like a very fine finesse weapon, like a rapier.
That's crazy.
I don't know why, but just it sounds like a finesse weapon, or it just sounds like a beefy, like I just have these gauntlets that are just gonna like face to face, I'm gonna fuck your world up.
So similar on the vein of the gauntlets, the first thing that came to my mind was like a warhammer, but like almost like a flaming, like a red, like almost like a glowing warhammer of some sort. Outside of that, weirdly enough, I was thinking of like Ember's Descent. Like I was almost thinking of like a bow and arrow of some sort, like some sort of like ranged, like, gosh. There's this one character in this phone game that I'm playing. I don't even know what its name is, but it has this move where it like shoots into the air and just like this rain of like fiery arrows come down. That was like one of the first things that came to mind when I heard that. So
he was Cosmic was actually thinking of a warbow as a warlock pack weapon. Its form can vary depending on the exact patron. Nice.
Good
guess. Yeah, that's very nice. Sounds like a cool thing, though.
Very nice.
Let us know what I'd like to know what ideas you have for like the different patrons and all of that.
Is this still for the same warlock, this Aarakocra?
I don't know. Maybe. I think he was trying to talk about what he wanted to do for that one. So we'll have to bring that up to us on Monday. I don't know if Kage is going to be here, but I think I'm going to end up doing another high-low. I might actually go back to D&D Beyond and look at Matt Mercer's, I think they're his subclasses.
Okay.
I might just take a look at his highs because he was on the high end, so I skipped him because it was kind of really unfair to do.
That's right. I remember you saying that.
It's like the dude's like a celebrity and like a master at
Everyone's
D&D.
gonna love those. Yeah.
Like it's not fair to high low him against somebody else, right? So I think I'll just tackle his individually. But hey, Cosmic, if you have any ideas for what you want to do with the different patrons and like the different types of bows or at least how they look, type it up in the Discord. Let us know. We'll definitely go over that on a Monday.
Heck yeah.
But yeah, I think that's going to be all for us. I cannot believe we went over 2 hours with that.
That's impressive. See, I told you.
I really did not expect. We stayed on topic. I just did not expect
sometimes.
Yeah, that was. I just my lights off now, and we finally finished up that convo. But yeah, surprisingly enough, I was not expecting that to be a whole 2 hours.
We made it work.
But yeah, so that was our answer, Cosmic. I was way off. Kage was right on it.
I hope that works out for you.
Yeah,
I'm very excited to see what this Umbral Ember's Descent. Gosh, that sounds crazy.
Yeah, get that typed up and let us know. But that's going to be us for today. Thank you guys for joining us. If you're joining us in chat, thank you so much for being here. And we'd enjoy the support. If you're joining us on YouTube in the future, go ahead and hit like and subscribe if you can. If you dislike it, go ahead and leave us a comment. Let us know what we can do better. Otherwise, you can catch us on Mondays at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for D&D Discussions Homebrew Review, where we take a viewer-submitted review, or we go online and we find some homebrew stuff that people created. We'll kind of give it some critiques, some ideas that we might add or, take away from it. And then kind of give it a rating based on how likely we are to use the item ourselves. And then here on Fridays at 7:30 Pacific Standard Time, you can always join us for our more deep dive episodes where we take a topic like this, whether it's our own homebrew or something from a book or something that we've heard from our audience. And we just kind of just talk more in detail about it, give our opinions, and kind of just give the beyond the book mentality of, what does the book give us the foundation for, and then how do we take it into our own hands. But otherwise, I think that's going to be it for all of us. You can, if you are in chat, you can find us on YouTube at Misfit Gamer Studios Live if you want to watch this or any of the other episodes that you've missed before. And you can also join our Discord, which I will go ahead and put a link into the Twitch chat right now. You can join our Discord. You can submit ideas and topics for us to talk about. You can submit questions for us to either answer in the Discord or here on stream, or you can submit your your own homebrew for us to review. I think that's pretty much it. I've already talked too much on this outro. Do you have anything for everybody for Friday?
I'm so glad to be here, and I'll see you guys next week. Deuces, right, my friends.
I hope you had a good week. I hope you guys have a fantastic weekend. We will see you on Monday, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Peace.